Historians enlarged this 1891 school portrait. What they found in the boy's pocket shocked everyone. The photograph arrived at the Richmond Historical Archives in early April, donated by the estate of a deceased collector who had accumulated thousands of historical images over his lifetime. Martin Rhodes, the archive's senior curator, had been processing the collection for weeks, cataloging and digitizing images that documented Virginia's past. Most were unremarkable standard family portraits, landscape views, commercial buildings, but this particular photograph immediately caught his attention. It was a formal class portrait from 1891, taken at what appeared to be an expensive private school. Approximately 20 boys, all dressed in identical dark suits with white shirts and bow ties, stood arranged in 3 rows on the steps of an impressive brick building. Their faces held the serious expressions typical of 19th century photography, when subjects had to remain still during long exposure times. The composition was professional, clearly the work of an experienced photographer commissioned for an important occasion. What made Martin pause was one boy in the second row, perhaps 12 years old, with light brown hair and an unusual expression. While the other students stared dutifully at the camera, this boy's eyes were cast slightly downward, his right hand positioned awkwardly across his chest, fingers pressed against his jacket pocket in a gesture that seemed protective rather than casual. Martin placed the photograph under his examination lamp and studied it more closely. The boy's posture suggested he was holding something, keeping it secure against his body. His expression carried a mixture of defiance and anxiety that transcended the usual discomfort of formal photography. There was a story here, Martin sensed, hidden in the details that a casual observer might miss. He began his standard documentation process, photographing the image under various lighting conditions and noting any identifying marks or inscriptions. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, was a brief notation: Ashford Academy, Richmond, Virginia. Class of 1891, spring term. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had added, "Thomas, may God forgive us for what we did." The cryptic message sent a chill through Martin. Something significant had happened involving this photograph, something that decades later still carried the weight of guilt or regret. He decided to use the archive's new digital enhancement equipment to examine the image more closely, particularly focusing on that boy Thomas and whatever he was protecting in his pocket. What Martin would discover would expose a friendship that violated every social boundary of Jim Crow Virginia, reveal the courage of children who refused to accept the racial hatred of their time, and ultimately document a tragedy that had been deliberately forgotten for over a century. Martin spent the following morning using digital enhancement software to examine every detail of the class photograph. He started with the overall composition, identifying architectural features that might help confirm the location. Then moved to individual faces, trying to match students with school records if such documents still existed. When he focused on Thomas, the boy with his hand pressed to his pocket and began adjusting contrast and brightness levels, something unexpected emerged. There was a rectangular shape visible through the fabric of the boy's jacket, something small and rigid that created a slight bulge. More striking was a tiny corner of what appeared to be paper or cardstock protruding slightly from the pocket's edge. So small it would have been invisible without magnification. Martin increased the resolution further, working pixel by pixel to enhance the visible portion of whatever Thomas was hiding. After nearly 2 hours of painstaking digital work, he could make out what appeared to be the edge of a photograph, another portrait, smaller than the class picture, tucked into Thomas's pocket and held secure by his protective hand. Why would a boy carry another photograph to a formal class portrait session? And why hold it so protectively, as if afraid someone might discover and confiscate it? Martin's curiosity intensified. He needed to find out more about Ashford Academy and, if possible, identify Thomas and learn his full story. He began with Richmond city directories from 1891, searching for any mention of Ashford Academy. He found it listed as Ashford Academy for Boys Classical Education for Sons of Distinguished Families, located on Monument Avenue, one of Richmond's most prestigious addresses. The school had been established in 1885 and operated until 1903, when it closed following financial difficulties. Martin contacted Dr. Angela Freeman, a historian at Virginia Commonwealth University who specialized in post-Reconstruction Virginia and the development of Jim Crow segregation. When he described the photograph and the hidden image in the boy's pocket, Angela's response was immediate interest mixed with concern. Monument Avenue in 1891 was the heart of Richmond's white elite society, she explained, when they met at the archives that afternoon. The families who sent their sons to Ashford Academy would have been wealthy, socially prominent, and deeply invested in maintaining racial hierarchies. If this boy was hiding something related to crossing racial boundaries, and your description suggests he might have been, he was taking an enormous risk. Angela examined the enhanced images Martin had prepared. "Can you enhance the visible portion of that hidden photograph any further?" she asked. "If we can see even a fragment of what's pictured, it might tell us what this boy was hiding and why." Martin worked for 3 more days on enhancing the tiny visible corner of the photograph in Thomas's pocket, using every digital tool and technique at his disposal. The process was tedious and uncertain. He was essentially trying to reconstruct an image from a fragment so small it represented perhaps 2% of the original photograph, viewed through fabric and captured by 1891 camera technology. But gradually, details emerged. The fragment showed what appeared to be part of a face specifically, a portion of a cheek and jaw that was distinctly darker in tone than would be expected for a white child. The photographic style matched the formal portrait conventions of the period, suggesting this was a professional studio portrait similar to the class photograph itself. Angela examined the enhanced images with growing excitement and sadness. "Martin, I think this boy was carrying a photograph of a black child in his pocket." To a formal class portrait at one of Richmond's most elite white schools in 1891, just as Jim Crow laws were being aggressively implemented throughout Virginia. The implications were staggering. By 1891, Virginia had already passed numerous laws enforcing racial segregation. Schools were strictly separated, with black children receiving drastically inferior education in underfunded, overcrowded facilities while white children attended well-equipped institutions like Ashford Academy. Social interaction between white and black children was not merely discouraged but actively prevented through legal and social mechanisms designed to maintain racial hierarchy. For a white boy from a wealthy family to not only know a black child well enough to possess his photograph, but to carry that photograph openly, albeit hidden, was an act of profound rebellion against the social order his family and school represented. Martin began searching for school records, hoping to identify Thomas and learn more about his background. Angela simultaneously researched prominent Richmond families from the 1890s, looking for families with sons named Thomas who would have been the right age in 1891. They found the breakthrough in an unexpected place: a society page announcement from the Richmond Dispatch newspaper, dated September 1890. It announced that young Thomas Whitfield, son of prominent attorney Harrison Whitfield, has enrolled at the prestigious Ashford Academy, where he will receive the classical education befitting his distinguished lineage. Thomas Whitfield. Martin now had a full name and a family connection. Harrison Whitfield had been one of Richmond's most successful lawyers, representing banks, railroads, and wealthy landowners. His family lived in a mansion on Franklin Street, employed numerous servants, and moved in the highest circles of Richmond society. "This makes the photograph even more remarkable," Angela noted. A boy from this background, carrying evidence of a forbidden friendship, risking everything his family represented. We need to find out who the other child was. Martin and Angela dove into research on the Whitfield family, searching for any clue that might explain how young Thomas had formed a friendship with a black child significant enough that he carried the child's photograph. City directories from the 1890s showed that the Whitfield household employed several servants, including a cook, 2 housemaids, and a groundskeeper, all listed only by first names. As was typical for black domestic workers in that era. Angela found more detailed information in census records from 1890. The Whitfield household included Harrison Whitfield, age 45, his wife Margaret, age 40, their 3 children, Thomas, age 11, Elizabeth, age 8, and Catherine, age 5. The census also listed 5 servants living in quarters behind the main house: Mary, cook, age 38, Sarah, housemaid, age 26, Ruth, housemaid, age 19, Joseph, groundskeeper, age 42, and notably a child named Daniel, listed as servant's son, age 11. "There," Angela said, pointing to Daniel's entry. "Same age as Thomas. If Daniel was living in the household, the boys would have had opportunities to interact, despite the social barriers designed to prevent exactly that kind of contact. Martin found additional information in city records. Joseph, the groundskeeper, had been employed by the Whitfield family since at least 1885. His wife Mary worked as the cook. Their son Daniel had been born in 1879, making him exactly the same age as Thomas Whitfield. They would have been living in proximity to each other for years, from early childhood through their preteen years. But proximity didn't guarantee friendship, especially in a society structured to maintain strict racial separation, even within households that included both white families and black servants. White children were typically taught from an early age to view black servants as fundamentally different and inferior, to maintain formal distance even when living in close quarters. Yet somehow, Thomas and Daniel, if Martin's theory was correct, had formed a bond strong enough that Thomas risked social disgrace by carrying Daniel's photograph. How had that friendship developed? And how had they maintained it in a world determined to prevent such connections? Angela located a memoir written in 1935 by a woman who had worked as a governess for wealthy Richmond families in the 1880s and 1890s. Though she didn't mention the Whitfields specifically, she described the complicated dynamics of households where white children and children lived in close proximity. The youngest children often played together, not yet understanding the social distinctions that would later separate them. But as the white children grew older, usually around age 7 or 8, families would intervene to establish proper boundaries. The friendships would be deliberately broken, often painfully for both children. If Thomas and Daniel had formed a friendship in early childhood, someone would have tried to separate them as they grew older. The fact that Thomas still carried Daniel's photograph at age 12 suggested they had somehow resisted that separation, maintaining a connection despite enormous social pressure. Martin decided to investigate whether he could identify the photographer who had taken the class portrait, hoping that studio records might provide additional information. The photograph's style and quality suggested it was the work of a professional studio, and Richmond in 1891 had several established photographers who served wealthy clients. He examined the class portrait again, looking for any photographer's mark or signature. Using magnification, he finally spotted it in the bottom right corner, so small it was nearly invisible. The embossed stamp read, Morrison & Sons, Photography Richmond. Martin found that Morrison & Sons had been one of Richmond's premier photography studios from 1882 to 1897, located on Main Street and known for high-quality portrait work. The studio's records had been donated to the Virginia Historical Society in the 1960s, though no one had thoroughly cataloged them. He and Angela spent a long day at the Historical Society, searching through boxes of Morrison & Sons business ledgers, negative logs, and correspondence. They found the entry for the Ashford Academy class portrait in a ledger from May 1891. Ashford Academy. Class portrait, 22 students. Commissioned by headmaster. Payment, $25, delivered June 1891. But they found something more significant in another. Ledger 1 that recorded individual portrait commissions. In March 1891, just 2 months before the class photograph, there was an entry that made both researchers freeze. Youth portrait. Daniel, no surname provided. Commissioned by Whitfield, payment, $2.50. Whitfield, Angela whispered. Margaret Whitfield, Thomas's mother. She commissioned a portrait of Daniel, the groundskeeper's son. This revelation changed everything they thought they understood about the situation. The photograph Thomas carried wasn't something he had obtained secretly or against his family's wishes. His own mother had commissioned it. Margaret Whitfield had paid to have a formal portrait taken of a black child, the son of her employees, and that portrait had somehow ended up in her son's possession. Why would a wealthy white woman in 1891 Richmond commission a formal portrait of her servant's child? Martin asked, though he could see Angela was already formulating theories. Maybe she understood the friendship between the boys, Angela suggested carefully. Maybe she even supported it, at least initially. But if that's true, something must have changed dramatically between March, when she commissioned Daniel's portrait, and May, when Thomas felt he needed to hide it during the class photograph. They needed to find out what had happened in those 2 months, and what had ultimately happened to both boys. Angela suggested searching Richmond newspaper archives from spring 1891. looking for any mention of the Whitfield family or any incidents that might explain the shift from Margaret Whitfield. Commissioning Daniel's portrait to Thomas, hiding it in his pocket. Martin spent 2 full days reviewing digitized newspapers from March through June 1891, scanning society pages, news reports, and editorial columns. He found several mentions of Harrison Whitfield in connection with legal cases and business dealings, and a few society page items mentioning Margaret Whitfield's involvement in various charitable organizations. But on April 28, 1891, he found something that made his heart race, a brief news item buried on page 5 of the Richmond Dispatch. Controversy at Ashford Academy. Several prominent families have expressed concern regarding alleged inappropriate associations between students and servants. Children on school grounds. Headmaster Cornelius Ashford has assured patrons that strict measures will be implemented to maintain proper social distinctions and prevent any interactions that might compromise the moral development of students. One family has reportedly withdrawn their son from the academy over the incident. The item was vague, typical of newspaper coverage in that era that alluded to scandals without explicit details, but the timing was significant, just 1 month after Margaret Whitfield had commissioned Daniel's portrait and 1 month before the class photograph was taken. Martin found a follow-up item from May 3, 1891 in the society section. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison Whitfield hosted a dinner for distinguished members of Richmond's legal community on Saturday evening. The gathering reflected the refined hospitality for which the Whitfields are justly renowned. The juxtaposition was notable, the Whitfields hosting a social event that reasserted their standing in Richmond society, immediately following the controversy at their son's school. Martin wondered if the dinner was deliberate, a public demonstration that the family remained respectable despite whatever incident had occurred. Angela found something even more revealing in the archives of a smaller, more sensationalist newspaper called the Richmond Observer. An editorial from May 10, 1891, written in the coded language typical of the era, criticized certain families of supposed distinction who failed to properly instruct their children in the natural and necessary boundaries that Providence has established between the races. While no names were mentioned, the editorial appeared just days after the Ashford Academy controversy. "They're talking about the Whitfields," Angela said with certainty. This editorial is a public rebuke, warning them that their son's behavior, his friendship with Daniel, was being noticed and judged by Richmond society. Martin found one more crucial piece in a letter to the editor published in the Richmond Dispatch on May 15, 1891, written by a concerned mother. "Our children's schools must remain sacred spaces where white youth can develop without the corrupting influence of inappropriate associations. A single student who refuses to maintain proper distance from inferior races can poison the moral atmosphere for all students. Families who cannot control their children should remove them from institutions that serve Richmond's finest families." The class photograph had been taken in late May 1891, just days after this letter was published. Thomas had been under enormous pressure from the school, from other families, probably from his own father, to end his friendship with Daniel. Yet he had carried Daniel's photograph to that formal class portrait, holding it against his chest in a gesture of protection and defiance. Through genealogical research, Angela discovered that Margaret Whitfield had kept a diary, portions of which had been preserved by a descendant and donated to a private archive at a women's college in Virginia. Angela contacted the archive and arranged to review the diary entries from 1891, hoping they might provide insight into Margaret's perspective on her son's forbidden friendship. The diary entries were revelatory. Margaret wrote regularly about household matters, social obligations, and her children's development. In January 1891, she had written, "Thomas and Daniel have grown so close over the years. I watch them in the garden and my heart both swells and breaks. They laugh together, share secrets, help each other with tasks. Thomas teaches Daniel letters and numbers. Daniel shows Thomas how to identify birds and plants. It is beautiful and innocent, the kind of friendship that exists before the world teaches children to hate. But I know it cannot last. Harrison has begun to notice and disapprove. Society will not permit such bonds to continue as the boys grow older." In March, around the time she commissioned Daniel's portrait, she wrote, "I have done something perhaps foolish, perhaps brave. I commissioned a portrait of Daniel for Morrison's studio. I told the photographer he was my godson, visiting from out of town, a lie that shamas me, but necessary. I want Thomas to have this image, something to remember that for a few brief years, before the world imposed its cruel divisions, he had a true friend. When they are inevitably separated, and I know this separation is coming, Thomas will have proof that Daniel existed, that their friendship was real, that one person in this hateful society saw Daniel as worthy of being photographed like any other child. But by late April, the tone had shifted dramatically. Disaster. The headmaster at Ashford discovered Thomas and Daniel together last week, in the alley behind our house. The boys had apparently been meeting there regularly when Thomas returned from school. Someone, I suspect one of the other mothers, reported seeing them. Harrison is furious. He says I have been too permissive, that I have failed to properly instruct Thomas in his social obligations. The headmaster has warned that Thomas will be expelled unless we take immediate action to prevent any further contact. Harrison has forbidden Thomas from speaking to Daniel under any circumstances. He has threatened to dismiss Joseph and Mary, to turn the entire family out without references, if the friendship continues. I am trapped between my son's happiness and our family's survival. The final relevant entry from May 1891 was heartbreaking. Thomas is devastated. He barely speaks to me now, understanding that I supported his friendship with Daniel but ultimately chose family reputation over his happiness. Perhaps he is right to judge me harshly. I did commission Daniel's portrait, gave it to Thomas, told him that true friendship transcends society's arbitrary divisions. But when faced with real consequences, Harrison's rage, the threat to our social standing, the possibility of Joseph and Mary losing their livelihood, I chose compliance over courage. Thomas has the photograph, but he has lost his friend. I see him sometimes holding that portrait when he thinks no one is watching, his face a portrait of grief. He is 12 years old and has learned the terrible lesson that love and friendship are not enough when confronted with society's power to destroy what it fears. Martin found additional context in a letter preserved among the Ashford Academy papers. Written by Headmaster Cornelius Ashford to Harrison Whitfield on May 20th, 1891, it read, Dear Mr. Whitfield, I write to confirm the arrangements for our annual class portrait, scheduled for May 27th. I trust that young Thomas understands the importance of this occasion and will conduct himself in a manner befitting his family's distinguished reputation. The recent unfortunate incident has been addressed, and I am confident that no further disciplinary action will be necessary. Several other families have expressed appreciation for the Academy's firm stance in maintaining proper social standards. I hope this matter can now be considered fully resolved. Respectfully, C. Ashford. The class portrait had been scheduled deliberately, Martin realized, as a sort of public test. Thomas would be photographed with his classmates, all the sons of Richmond's elite families, demonstrating that he had been brought back into conformity, that his inappropriate association had been corrected. But Thomas had brought Daniel's photograph with him that day, hidden in his pocket. It was an act of quiet rebellion. He would comply with the outward requirements of his society, would stand with his classmates for the formal portrait, but he would not abandon his friend even in symbol. Daniel would be there with him, invisible to everyone else but known to Thomas. Angela found a detail that made the gesture even more poignant. In Margaret's diary, an entry from May 26, 1891, the day before the class portrait, she had written, Tomorrow Thomas must have his class portrait taken. He has been silent and withdrawn for weeks. This evening I found him in his room and we truly spoke for the first time since this horrible situation began. He told me he understands why we had to separate him from Daniel, that he knows Harrison would have carried out his threat to dismiss Joseph and Mary, leaving them without income or references. But he said, Mother, they can control my actions, but they cannot control my heart. They can prevent me from seeing Daniel, but they cannot make me stop caring about him. He showed me Daniel's portrait, which he plans to carry tomorrow. I should have forbidden it, but I could not. Let him have this small act of defiance. Let him preserve his conscience even as we destroy his happiness. The class portrait, taken the next day, captured that moment, Thomas standing with his privileged classmates, outwardly conforming to the expectations of his race and class, but inwardly holding on to a friendship that society had declared impossible and forbidden. The photograph in his pocket was his silent protest, visible only now, more than a century later, through digital enhancement and historical investigation. Martin and Angela worked to trace what happened to both boys after 1891. The records were fragmentary, but they gradually pieced together the tragic continuation of the story. Thomas Whitfield continued at Ashford Academy through 1895, graduating at age 16. His name appeared occasionally in society pages. He attended the appropriate social functions, participated in expected activities. But Angela found something unexpected in the enrollment records of the University of Virginia. Thomas had enrolled in 1895 but left after only 1 year, highly unusual for a young man from his background. Margaret's diary entries from this period were sparse but revealing. In October 1896, she wrote, "Thomas has announced he will not return to university. He says he cannot bear the hypocrisy, the constant performance of belonging to a society he despises. Harrison is furious, but Thomas is now 18 and legally able to make his own choices. He speaks of going north, perhaps to Philadelphia or Boston, where he says people think differently about such matters. I fear he idealizes the North. Prejudice exists there too, but I understand his need to escape Richmond, to escape the memories of Daniel and what we forced him to give up." City directories showed that Thomas Whitfield did leave Richmond in 1897. Angela found him in Philadelphia census records from 1900, working as a clerk and living in a modest boarding house, a dramatic fall from his family's social position. He never married, dying in 1923 at age 44. His obituary in a Philadelphia newspaper described him as a quiet man who kept largely to himself, known for his generous donations to educational charities serving Negro children. The detail about the donations struck both researchers. Thomas had spent his adult life supporting the education of black children, perhaps trying to honor the friendship that had been stolen from him, perhaps trying to create the world he had imagined as a 12-year-old boy who believed friendship should transcend racial barriers. Daniel's fate was harder to trace, given the limited records for black families in this era. But Angela found references to Joseph in Richmond city directories through 1892. Still working as a groundskeeper, though no longer for the Whitfield family, Harrison had apparently carried out his threat. Joseph and his family disappeared from Richmond records after 1892. Through extensive searching in census records from other states, Angela eventually found what she believed was the same family in Pennsylvania in 1900. Joseph worked as a groundskeeper at a school, Mary as a cook. Daniel, now 21, was listed as a teacher at a school for black children. He had gotten the education that Thomas had tried to provide years earlier, had become the educated man that his friend had believed he could be. Daniel lived until 1945, Angela discovered through death records. He had spent 40 years teaching, had married, and had 4 children. An oral history interview conducted in 1943 with one of Daniel's former students described him as a man who believed deeply in education as liberation, who told us that knowledge was something no one could ever take from us. The story had no happy ending, no reunion between childhood friends. Society had successfully separated them, had enforced its racial boundaries, had punished their families for allowing the friendship to exist. But neither boy had completely surrendered to that system. Each had found ways, limited and imperfect, to resist and to preserve some element of what they had valued in each other. Martin and Angela organized an exhibition at the Richmond Historical Archives titled Hidden Friendship, Thomas and Daniel, 1891. They displayed the enhanced class portrait showing the photograph in Thomas's pocket, excerpts from Margaret's diary, the newspaper articles documenting the controversy, and information about both boys' later lives. The exhibition drew enormous attention, generating conversations about the Jim Crow era, the ways racial segregation was enforced even in personal relationships, and the courage required to maintain human connection across barriers designed to prevent exactly that. School groups visited, often leading to powerful discussions as young people tried to understand a world where friendship could be forbidden based solely on race. On opening day, Martin stood before the enlarged class portrait, looking at Thomas's face, that mixture of defiance and grief, the protective hand holding Daniel's image against his chest. Beside him stood 3 visitors who had specifically requested to attend the opening, descendants of Daniel, who had learned about the exhibition through news coverage. One of them, a woman named Patricia, who was Daniel's great-granddaughter, stood quietly crying as she looked at the photograph. "My great-grandfather never talked about his childhood in Richmond," she said softly. "He told his children he had grown up in Virginia but left as a young man to find better opportunities. We never knew there was more to the story. We never knew about Thomas." She held a small photograph in her hand, a formal portrait of a young black boy, dressed carefully, looking directly at the camera with dignity and quiet strength. It was Daniel, the same portrait that Thomas had carried in his pocket in 1891. "This has been in our family for generations," Patricia explained. "My grandfather said it was important, that it represented something significant, but he didn't know what." "Now I understand. Someone valued my great-grandfather enough to have this portrait made, at a time when black children were not usually considered worthy of formal photography. Someone saw him as equal, as worthy, as human. That someone was Thomas." Angela had found evidence that Margaret Whitfield had commissioned 2 copies of Daniel's portrait, one for Thomas and one that she had apparently given to Daniel's mother, Mary. Both families had preserved these photographs for over a century, not knowing the full story but understanding that the images represented something important, something worth keeping. Martin arranged for both portraits to be displayed side by side in the exhibition. Thomas's class portrait with Daniel's photograph hidden in his pocket, and Daniel's individual portrait that had been kept by his descendants. Together, they told the story of a friendship that society had tried to erase, but that had refused to be completely forgotten. The exhibition included a final panel with photographs of the charitable work Thomas had supported in Philadelphia and information about Daniel's teaching career. Despite their separation, both had spent their lives working to create a more just world, to honor the connection they had formed as children before understanding that society would not permit it to continue. Visitors often lingered at this final panel, reading about the complicated legacy of the 2 boys. Some wept. Some stood in angry silence, processing the cruelty of a system that could destroy childhood friendship in the name of racial hierarchy. Young people, especially, seemed moved by the realization that children their own age had once faced such obstacles to simple human connection. A teacher brought her racially diverse class to the exhibition, and Martin overheard her explaining the story. One student asked, did they ever see each other again when they were grown up and could make their own choices? The teacher looked to Martin, who shook his head sadly. "There's no evidence they ever reunited," he said gently. "Sometimes that's how injustice works. It doesn't just affect the moment, it changes the entire trajectory of lives." Thomas and Daniel were separated at 12, and they never found their way back to each other. Another student, a young black girl, studied Daniel's portrait intently. "But we know about them now," she said. "We know they were friends. We know Thomas carried Daniel's picture even when he wasn't supposed to. That matters, right? That we know?" Martin smiled through unexpected tears. "Yes," he said. "That matters very much. That's why we preserve these photographs and tell these stories, so that people like Thomas and Daniel are not forgotten, so that we remember both the injustice and the courage, so that we understand how far we've come and how vigilant we must remain." The photograph that had seemed like a simple class, portrait 20 privileged boys on the steps of an elite academy, had revealed a profound story of friendship, rebellion, and loss. And Thomas's protective hand, holding Daniel's image against his heart, continued to teach its lesson more than a century later, that human connection is more powerful than the barriers society erects, even when those barriers ultimately succeed in separating people who care for each other. The exhibition would run for 6 months and thousands would see it. But more importantly, Thomas and Daniel's story would enter the historical record permanently, proof that even in the darkest periods of American racial history, there were individuals, even children, who refused to accept hatred as inevitable, who held on to friendship even when society declared it impossible, and who carried their resistance forward, hidden in a pocket, waiting for the day when someone would finally see what had been there all along.